Chapter 41. V.S. Ramachandran. The following are quotes from his 1998 book, Phantoms in the Brain. There is something uniquely odd about a hairless, neotenous primate that has evolved into a species that can look back over its own shoulder and ask questions about its origins. And odder still, the brain can not only discover how other brains work, but also ask questions about its own existence. Who am I? What happens after death? Does my mind arise exclusively from neurons in my brain? And if so, what scope is there for free will? It is the peculiar recursive quality of these questions, as the brain struggles to understand itself, that makes neurology fascinating. In a nutshell, unraveling the weirder cases in neurology can provide insights into how we perceive ourselves. Books in a similar vein. Viktor Frankl's The Will to Meaning, Anna Freud's The Ego and the Mechanisms of Defense, William James' The Principles of Psychology, and Oliver Sacks' The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. What is consciousness? What is the self? Such big questions have been the preserve of philosophers for thousands of years. Now, with our increasingly advanced knowledge of the brain itself, science is entering the debate. V.S. Ramachandran, one of the world's top neuroscientists, says that the study of the brain is still too young to be knitted into some grand theory of consciousness, in the way that Einstein came up with the theory of relativity, but that perhaps we are at the early stages of such an understanding. Phantoms of the Brain, Probing the Mysteries of the Human Mind, written with Sandra Blakesley, is Ramachandran's best-selling foray into the mysteries of the mind, and it is a revelation. After reading this book, you will never again be able to lift your arm, or grab a cup, and take it for granted. While scientists are apt to develop theories and then find the evidence to support them, Ramachandran does the opposite, purposely embracing the medical anomalies that current science cannot easily explain away. For readers with an interest in psychiatry, perhaps the standout message of the book is that many cases previously diagnosed as madness are now better understood as malfunctions in brain circuitry. Seemingly crazy behaviors may not mean that a person is insane. As well as getting us abreast of basic cranial anatomy, the book is also entertaining. Sherlock Holmes-loving Ramachandran admits he is not your average scientist and includes quotations from Shakespeare and holistic healing guru Deepak Chopra, as well as references to Freud and Indian religion. Instead of counting off his academic accomplishments, he reveals his intellectual debt to popular science books. Such broad-mindedness makes Phantoms of the Mind a pleasure to read, even if you have never heard of a thalamus or a frontal lobe. Though it can ramble a little, Ramachandran's informal style conveys his wonder and amazement at how a mass of wet gray cells can create self-awareness and consciousness. The Bits of the Brain. Ramachandran notes an astounding fact. A piece of your brain the size of a grain of sand would contain 100,000 neurons, 2 million axons, and 1 billion synapses, all talking to each other. He details the various parts, including the 4 lobes, frontal, temporal, parietal, and occipital, which form the 2 halves of the walnut. Each of these hemispheres controls movement on the opposite side of the body. The left half controls movement on our right side and vice versa. The left hemisphere tends to be that part of the brain that talks all the time, whether in thought or speech, the rational aspect of consciousness. The right relates more to our emotions and a holistic awareness of life. The frontal lobes are often considered the most human part of the brain, where the facilities of wisdom, planning, and judgment are based. Other features include the corpus callosum, a band of fibers that connects the 2 halves, the medulla oblongata at the top of the spinal cord, which regulates blood pressure, heart rate, and breathing, the thalamus, which sits at the center of the brain and through which all the senses except smell are relayed, thought to be a primitive part of the brain, and underneath is the hypothalamus, related to drives such as aggression, sex, and fear, and also to hormonal and metabolic functions, Despite this basic knowledge, Ramachandran notes, we are still not really sure how memory and perception occur. For example, are memories housed in particular parts of the brain, or is memory more holistic, involving the whole brain? The author suggests that both explanations may be true, in that while particular parts of the brain have certain jobs, it is in understanding how they interact that we begin to get closer to comprehending what makes up human nature. Phantom limbs. What does the title Phantoms in the Brain refer to? Ramachandran is best known for his work with people who experience phantom limbs. After an amputation or paralysis, a person will have all the normal sensations of the limb. The worst part is that people can actually experience a lot of pain in their phantom limbs. Ramachandran wondered how and where these phantoms were generated in the nervous system. Why does the sensation of having a limb remain frozen in the brain after amputation? Through experiments and work with patients, he explains phantom limb sensation thus. Essentially, the brain has a body image, a representation of itself that includes the arms and legs. When a limb is lost, it may take a while for the brain to catch up to this fact. The conventional view is that, in shock over the loss of an arm or leg, the person engages in wishful thinking that the limb is still there, or goes into denial that it is lost. But Ramachandran points out that most of the people he sees are not neurotic. Indeed, he treated a woman, Mirabelle, who was born without arms and yet has vivid sensations of their use. This suggests that the brain is hardwired for limb coordination and wants to enjoy that use even when sensory information tells it there is nothing there to move. He mentions another case where a girl frequently used her fingers to do simple calculations in arithmetic, except that she was born without forearms. What usually happens when a person loses a limb is that their brain keeps sending signals to use it, but in time the feedback that there is no limb is enough for the sensations to stop. Unlike amputees, however, people actually born without arms have never received the sensory feedback from their stumps that anything has changed, so their brain can keep on believing that they have arms to use. Denial of limb paralysis. Anosognosia is a syndrome in which a patient, obviously sane in most respects, denies that their arm or leg has become paralyzed, but the denial happens only if it is their left arm or leg. What causes this disorder? Is it simply wishful thinking? And why only left limbs? Ramachandran's explanation involves the division of labor between the two brain hemispheres. The left hemisphere works to create belief systems or models of reality. It is conformist in nature and always tries to cling tenaciously to the way things were. Therefore, when it has new information that does not fit into the model, it employs defense mechanisms of denial or repression in order to preserve the status quo. The job of the right hemisphere, conversely, is to challenge the status quo and look for inconsistencies in any sign of change. When the right hemisphere is damaged, the left hemisphere is free to pursue its denials and confabulations. Without the right's reality check, the mind wanders down a path of self-delusion. Preserving the self at all costs. Ramachandran's work with people living with anosognosia seems to prove the Freudian idea of defense mechanisms, that is, thoughts and behaviors whose purpose is to protect the idea we have of ourselves. Neurology's task is to discover why people rationalize and avoid reality, only it involves considerations of brain wiring instead of the psyche. Patients in denial mode are the best way to research this because their defense mechanisms are concentrated and amplified. The brain will do anything to preserve a sense of self. This evolved perhaps because the brain and nervous system involve so many different systems, and a grand illusion is necessary to tie them all together. To survive, to be social, to mate, we need to have the experience of being an autonomous being who is in charge. However, the part of us that is in charge is in fact only a small part of our whole being. The rest carries on automatically, zombie-like. Weird and Wonderful Cases. Ramachandran refers to Thomas Kuhn in his landmark book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, which noted that science tends to sweep the unusual cases under the carpet until they can be fitted into established theories. But Ramachandran's view turns this on its head. We can get closer to generalities by solving the strange cases. Consider just 3 he discusses. 1. Hemi-neglect patients are indifferent to objects and events in the left side of the world, sometimes even indifferent to the left side of their own bodies. Ellen doesn't eat the food on the left of her plate, doesn't put makeup on the left side of her face, and doesn't even brush the teeth on the left side of her mouth. Though alarming to the people living with her, the condition is not uncommon and often follows strokes in the right brain, especially in the right parietal lobe. 2. Capgras delusion is a rare neurological condition in which the patient comes to regard their own parents, children, spouse, or sibling as imposters. The patient can identify these people, but does not experience any emotion when looking at their faces, which leads the brain to create the assumption that they must be imposters. In neurological terms, there is a disconnection between the face recognition area in the temporal cortex and the amygdala, a gateway to the limbic system, which helps generate emotional responses to particular faces. And 3. Cotard syndrome is a bizarre condition where people believe themselves to be dead. They claim to smell their rotting flesh and see worms crawling in and out of their carcass. Ramachandran suggests this comes about through a connection failure between the sensory areas of the brain and the limbic system, which deals with emotions. Patients literally no longer feel any kind of emotion and therefore disengage from life. The only way their brain can deal with the situation is to presume that they are no longer alive. What is consciousness? Such bizarre cases, because they are easier to form experiments around, can reveal how the normal mind works. We take our representation of the world for granted, yet if our wiring goes slightly wrong, our whole conception of what is real and what is not can fail us. We begin to understand that our sense of reality is really more like an elaborate illusion designed to allow us to make our way in the world and survive. If we had to deal with the act of pure perception every second, we would never accomplish anything. We need to take for granted a basic amount of reality perception, and normally the brain delivers this brilliantly. It is only when things go wrong that we see how finely balanced consciousness is. The amygdala and the temporal lobes play a vital role in consciousness. Without these, Ramachandran says, we would effectively be robots, unable to sense the meaning of what we are doing. We not only have circuitry in the brain that tells us how to do things, we also have pathways that tell us why we do them. He devotes a whole chapter to the link between increased religious feeling and temporal lobe epilepsy. When this part of the brain has a seizure, the person can suddenly see everything in an intense spiritual way. Establishing the different meanings of things, including the ability to discuss the fact that we are conscious, is what separates humans from all other animals. But if this facility is damaged or altered, it is possible for people to experience too much meaning. Final comments. Ramachandran says that the greatest revolution in the history of the human race will be when we really begin to understand ourselves. He has called for more funding of research into the brain, not simply to satisfy our curiosities, but because this is where all the nasty stuff, war, violence, terrorism, originates. Neurology provides knowledge of the brain's anatomy and circuitry, and we need this as a starter. But the larger task is to understand the relationship between a mass of gray cells and the sense we have of being free-willed individuals. Even if, as Ramachandran suggests, the sense of self is an elaborate illusion created by our brain to ensure that our bodies survive, it is also how we interact with the universe at a philosophical or spiritual level. This is unique in the animal world, therefore we should treat it as precious and deserving of much further study. V.S. Ramachandran. Vilayanur Ramachandran grew up in India and obtained his MD at Stanley Medical College in Chennai, Madras, and his PhD at Cambridge University. He is currently director of the Center for Brain and Cognition, University of California, San Diego, and adjunct professor in biology at the Salk Institute for Biological Studies. Awards include the Arends Kappers Medal from the Netherlands, a gold medal from the Australian National University, and a fellowship from All Souls College, Oxford. Ramachandran has presented major lecture series around the world, including the 2003 Wreath Lectures in Britain and the Decade of the Brain Lecture for the U.S. National Institute for Mental Health. Phantoms in the Brain was made into a two-part documentary, shown on Channel 4 in the UK and PBS in the US. Other books include Encyclopedia of the Human Brain, 2002, The Emerging Mind, 2003, and A Brief Tour of Human Consciousness, 2005. Co-author Sandra Blakesley is a science writer for the New York Times, specializing in cognitive neuroscience. Chapter 42. Carl Rogers. The following are quotes from his 1961 book, On Becoming a Person. If I can provide a certain type of relationship, the other person will discover within himself the capacity to use that relationship for growth, and change in personal development will occur. It seems that gradually, painfully, the individual explores what is behind the masks he presents to the world, and even behind the masks with which he has been deceiving himself. Thus, to an increasing degree, he becomes himself, not a facade of conformity to others, not a cynical denial of all feeling, nor a front of intellectual rationality, but a living, breathing, feeling, fluctuating process. In short, he becomes a person. In a nutshell, a genuine relationship or interaction is one in which you are comfortable to be yourself, and in which the other person clearly sees your potential. Books in a similar vein. Robert Bolton's People Skills. Milton Erickson's My Voice Will Go With You. Abraham Maslow's The Farther Reaches of Human Nature. Fritz Perls' Gestalt Therapy. And Douglas Stone, Bruce Patton, and Sheila Heen's Difficult Conversations. Have you ever felt healed by a long conversation with someone? Has a particular relationship made you feel normal or good about yourself again? Chances are that these interactions happened in an environment that was trusting, open, and frank, and in which you were given full attention and really listened to without judgment. Carl Rogers took these features of a good relationship and applied them to his work as a psychologist and counselor. The result was a revolutionary overturning of the traditional psychologist-patient model, which has had broader implications for successful human interaction. Rogers came to his profession with the assumption that he would be the superior practitioner solving the problems of whoever came to see him. But he began to realize that this model was rarely effective, and that progress depended more on the depth of understanding and openness between the two people sitting in the consulting room. He was strongly influenced by existential philosopher Martin Buber and his notion of confirming the other. This meant fully affirming a person's potential, the ability to see what he or she has been created to become. Such a shift in emphasis toward the possible, as opposed to merely the problematic, made Rogers, along with Abraham Maslow, a major figure in the new humanistic psychology, with its notions that we take for granted today about personal growth and human potential. On Becoming a Person, a therapist's view of psychotherapy is not a single piece of writing, but a collection of pieces that Rogers wrote over a decade. It is the accumulated wisdom of a career of psychotherapy spanning over 30 years. And while not an easy read, once you get to grips with the ideas, it can be very inspiring. Letting everyone be themselves. In his training as a psychologist, Rogers naturally absorbed the idea that he controlled the relationship with the client, and that it was his job to analyze and treat patients as if they were objects. But he came to the conclusion that it was more effective to let patients, or clients, guide the direction of the process. This was the beginning of his famous client-centered, or person-centered, form of therapy. Rather than trying to fix clients, Rogers felt it was much more important to listen absolutely to what they were saying, even if it seemed wrong, weak, strange, stupid, or bad. This stance allowed people to be accepting of all their thoughts, and after a number of sessions, they would heal themselves. Rogers summed up his philosophy as simply to be myself and let another person be himself. As this was a time when the study of psychology revolved around the behavior of rats in laboratories, his belief in letting crazy patients set the direction was a big challenge to the profession, and many denounced his ideas. If this were not enough, Rogers also shattered the idea of the calm and collected therapist who objectively listened to clients' issues. He asserted the right of therapists to have a personality, to express emotions themselves. If, for instance, in the course of the session he felt hostile or annoyed, he would not pretend to be a pleasant, detached doctor. If he did not have an answer, he would not claim he did. If the psychologist-client relationship was to rest on truth, he felt, it had to include the moods and feelings of the practitioner. At the heart of Rogers' work was the view that life is a flowing process. The fulfilled person, he believed, should come to accept themselves as a stream of becoming, not a finished product. The mistake people made was to try to control all aspects of their experience, with the result that their personality was not grounded in reality. Becoming a real person. Rogers observed that when people first came to see a counselor for treatment, they usually gave a reason, such as issues with a wife or husband, or an employer, or their own uncontrollable behavior. Invariably, these reasons were not the real problem. There was in fact just one problem with all the people he saw. They were desperate to become their real selves, to be allowed to drop the false roles or masks with which they had approached life to date. They were usually very concerned with what others thought of them, and what they ought to be doing in given situations. Therapy brought them back to their immediate experience of life and situations. They became a person, not just a reflection of society. One aspect of this transformation was that people began to own all aspects of themselves, to allow totally contradictory feelings. One client admitted that she both loved and hated her parents. Rogers' dictum was, "The facts are always friendly when it comes to sorting out one's emotions and feelings. The real danger is in denying what we feel. As each feeling we are ashamed of comes to the surface, we realize it will not kill us to allow it to exist." Final comments. Rogers' impact was felt way beyond his own field of counseling psychology. His emphasis on people needing to see themselves more as a fluid process of creation rather than a fixed entity was part of the climate of ideas that led to the 1960s counter-cultural revolution, and it is easy to see his influence on today's self-help writers. For instance, one of Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People is, "Seek first to understand, then to be understood." A very Rogerian notion that progress in relationships is never made unless the people within them feel safe to speak their mind and be heard. And the rallying cry to live your passion can also in part be traced back to Rogers' focus on living a life that expresses who we truly are. Rogers felt that psychologists had the most important job in the world because ultimately it was not the physical sciences that would save us, but better interactions between human beings. The climate of openness and transparency he created in his sessions, if replicated within the family, the corporation, or in politics, would result in less angst and more constructive outcomes. But the key was a desire to really feel what the other person or party wanted and felt. Such a willingness, although never easy, could transform those involved. Carl Rogers. Born in 1902 in Chicago into a strict religious household, Rogers was the fourth of 6 children. At the University of Wisconsin, he studied agriculture, then history, but his aim was to enter the Christian ministry. In 1924, he enrolled in the liberal Union Theological Seminary in New York City, but after 2 years, felt hemmed in by doctrinal beliefs and began taking courses in psychology at Columbia University's Teachers College. There he obtained his M.A. in 1928 and his Ph.D. in 1931. With doctoral work in child psychology, Rogers obtained a post as a psychologist at the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children in Rochester, New York, working with troubled or delinquent children. Though not academically prestigious, the post enabled him to support his young family, and he stayed there for 12 years. In 1940, on the strength of his book, Clinical Treatment of the Problem Child, he was offered a professorship at Ohio State University. His influential Counseling and Psychotherapy was published in 1942, and in 1945 he began a 12-year posting at the University of Chicago, where he established a counseling center. Client-centered therapy, 1951, further heightened Rogers' profile, and in 1954 he received the American Psychological Association's first Distinguished Scientific Achievement Award. In 1964 he moved to La Jolla, California, for a position at the Western Behavioral Studies Institute, and remained in California until his death in 1987. He was also well known for his work on encounter groups, for his contribution to theories of experimental learning for adults, and for his impact in the area of conflict resolution. Chapter 43. Oliver Sacks. The following are quotes from his 1970 book, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. Neurology and psychology, curiously, although they talk of everything else, almost never talk of judgment. And yet it is precisely the downfall of judgment which constitutes the essence of so many neuropsychological disorders. The superturitaire, then, is compelled to fight, as no one else is, simply to survive, to become an individual, and survive as one, in the face of constant impulse. The miracle is that, in most cases, he succeeds. For the powers of survival, the will to survive, and to survive as a unique, inalienable individual, are absolutely the strongest in our being, stronger than any impulses, stronger than disease. Health militant, is usually the victor. In a nutshell, the genius of the human brain is its continual creation of a sense of self, which persists even in the face of terrible neurological disease. Books in a similar vein: Viktor Frankl's The Will to Meaning, William James' The Principles of Psychology, and V.S. Ramachandran's Phantoms in the Brain. As a neurologist, Oliver Sacks notes at the beginning of The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat and Other Clinical Tales, which was a massive bestseller around the world and made him famous, he has always been equally interested in diseases and people. A lifetime's work convinced him that it is often less a matter of what disease does this person have than what person has the disease. You can't examine a patient as if they are an insect. You are talking about a self. This is all the more important in neurology, which involves a physical dysfunction of the brain that often affects a person's sense of who they are. Sacks' book aims to show that even when people's normal faculties desert them, they retain an unmistakable uniqueness. For Sacks, who has seen many strange cases, how people adapt or reinvent themselves in the face of mental or physical setbacks is amazing. The book's 24 chapters detail a myriad of strange and interesting cases that give it the page-turning quality of a novel. Part 1 is titled Losses, and it relates to people who have battled to return to a sense of normal self after suffering some debilitating loss of mental faculty. Jimmy's Lost Decades. Without memories, is it possible to have a self? Sacks tells us about Jimmy G., a 49-year-old admitted to the old people's home where Sacks was working in 1975. Jimmy was a handsome, healthy man and very genial. He had been drafted into the U.S. Navy on his graduation from school and became a radio operator on a submarine. But while talking about his personal history and family life, Sachs noticed that Jimmy was talking in the present tense. He asked Jimmy what year it was, and received a reply to the effect of, 1945, of course. For Jimmy, the war was won. Truman was president, and he was looking forward to going to college on the GI Bill. He believed he was 19. Sachs went out of the consulting room, and when he returned 2 minutes later, Jimmy seemed to have no idea who he was. It was as if their session had never happened. Jimmy was apparently living in a permanent present. His long-term memory stopped dead in 1945. With his ability in science, he had no trouble solving complex problems in tests, but was disturbed by what seemed like major changes in the world around him. He could not deny that the man in the mirror was in his late 40s, but was not able to explain it. Sachs wrote in his notes that his patient was without a past or future, stuck in a constantly changing, meaningless moment. He diagnosed the condition as Korsakoff syndrome, damage to the mammillary bodies in the brain caused by alcohol. This affects memory, although the rest of the brain experiences no change. Sachs located Jimmy's brother, who noted that Jimmy had left the Navy in 1965, and without the structure it provided, began drinking heavily. For some reason, he had experienced retrograde amnesia, going back to 1945. Sachs asked Jimmy to keep a diary so that he knew what he had done the day before. But this did nothing to give him a sense of continuity, as it was as if the events he read about had happened to someone else. Jimmy seemed to have been de-souled. Something was missing in terms of a self. Sachs asked the religious sisters in the old people's home whether they thought Jimmy had indeed lost his soul. Somewhat affronted, they responded by telling him to watch Jimmy when he was in chapel. When Sachs went to observe him there, it was a different Jimmy. He seemed lost in the act of worship and the ritual of the Mass, somehow more together than before. The level of spiritual meaning was obviously enough to overcome his normal mental chaos. Sachs writes, "Memory, mental activity, mind alone could not hold him, but moral attention and action could hold him completely." The same was true if Jimmy was in the garden, or looking at art, or listening to music. Thus, although Jimmy was dead to the normal experience of memory that we feel gives us a sense of self, at other times he was evidently a fully alive person, gaining meaning from experience. Through a careful regimen of like activity, he was able to maintain a sense of calm. There was still some part of him, whether a soul or a self, that had found a way to exist, despite the disease. The Self versus Tourette's. Part 2 of The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat is titled Excesses. The cases looked at involve not a loss but a superabundance of certain functions: flights of fancy, exaggerated perception, irrational exuberance, manias. These hyperstates actually give the people involved a heightened sense of life that normality does not. While they are technically ill, such conditions give subjects a feeling of great well-being and zest for life, although in the back of their mind there is the feeling that it cannot last. The functions meld with the person's identity, so that some may not want to be cured. One example of neurological excess is a syndrome first described in 1885. Gilles de la Tourette was a pupil of the pioneering neurologist Charcot, as was Freud, and recorded a condition of tics, extravagant motions, cursing, funny noises, mad humor, and strange compulsions. There were varying degrees of the syndrome, and it was manifested differently in each sufferer, from benign to violent. Because of its inexplicable strangeness and relative rarity, Tourette's was largely forgotten about in the medical world. However, the condition never went away, and by the 1970s there was a Tourette's Syndrome Association that grew to have thousands of members. Research confirmed Gilles de la Tourette's initial belief that it was a brain disorder, centered in the old brain, the most primitive part of the human brain, involving the thalamus, hypothalamus, limbic system, and amygdala, the instinctual areas that together form the basic personality. Touretters were found to have more than the usual amount of exciter transmitters in their brains, particularly the transmitter dopamine. People with Parkinson's have a lack of dopamine. They can be treated with a drug, Haldol, which counteracts the excess. But Tourette's is not simply a matter of brain chemistry, for there are times, such as when singing, dancing, or acting, that Touretters lose their normal tics and behaviors. In such cases, Sachs observes, the I of the person seems to overcome the it of their condition. Normal people assume that they own their perceptions, reactions, and movements, so it is easy to have a strong sense of self. Touretters are so constantly bombarded with uncontrollable impulses that it is amazing if their ego can manage to keep a sense of self. Some people, Sachs notes, are able to take Tourette's and incorporate it into their personality, even making use of the way it increases their rate of thinking. Others are simply possessed by it. Ray, 24, came to Sachs with a rather extreme version of Tourette's. Every few seconds he went into a convulsive tic, which frightened everyone except those who knew him well. With high intelligence, wit, humor, and sound character, Ray had got through school and college, and even married. He had obtained jobs but had been fired from each for his behavior, which was pugnacious, and included blurting out swear words. His Tourette's was a sudden intruder that he did his best to incorporate into his weekend role as a jazz drummer, producing sometimes wild drum solos. The only time he was free of his condition was while asleep, just after sex, or when deeply engaged in some task. Ray was willing to try Haldol, but was worried what would be left of him if his tics went away. He had, after all, been like this since he was 4. When the drug began to work, Ray had to deal with himself as a different person. During the week, when at work, the drug made him a sober, tic-free, even dull individual. But as he missed his old, intense, convulsive, wisecracking self, the only self he had ever known, he chose not to take the drug at the weekend, so he could be witty, ticky Ray, as he called himself. In this case, which was Ray's real self? Sachs does not offer an answer, but points to the story as an example of resilience of spirit. There is always some I inside us that seeks to assert itself, even in the face of an extreme it that can take us over. The Enchanted Loom. Sachs notes that our current model for understanding the brain is based on the computer. But he asks, could algorithms and programs account for the rich way we experience reality, in terms of the dramatic, the artistic, the musical? How do we reconcile the idea of memories being held in the back of the brain's computer and reminiscence of the type expressed by Proust and other great writers in works of literature? Surely a human is not just a thinking machine, but a being who lives through the meaningfulness of experience, having an iconic representation of reality that takes account of the vivid sense of things, their wholeness. English physiologist Charles Sherrington imagined the brain as an enchanted loom, constantly weaving patterns of meaning. This analogy, Sachs suggests, is surely better than the computer in explaining the very personal nature of experience and the way meaning is gained over time. His own analogy for understanding the brain is in terms of scripts and scores. Our lives are akin to a script that makes sense of them as we go along, or perhaps a musical score that does the same. Ultimately, then, the prism through which we grasp our lives should not be scientific or mathematical. This would do for the left brain's functioning, perhaps, but artistic. For the right brain, which is so deeply involved in the creation of this thing we feel to be the self, meaning must be gained through the artful scenery and melody of experience and action. From one angle, humans may look like advanced robots, responding to their environment via a neurological computer. But to form a self require something more. Sachs notes, empirical science takes no account of the soul, no account of what constitutes and determines personal being. It is this something that his patients were striving to get back, or retain, in the face of an invader. Final comments. It is only when something goes neurologically wrong that we realize how much we take for granted the effort that goes into keeping up the feeling of being an autonomous being, always in control. We are a miracle of integration, Sachs says, and often underestimate just how strong the will of the self is to assert itself in the face of the forces of disintegration, such as neurological damage or disease. Were the brain merely a computer, it could not bring itself back from the edge of chaos to re-establish a sense of meaning and independence. Rather than simply efficient operation, the human mind strives for wholeness. It seeks to create meaning out of random sensation and experience. A painting or a symphony is not just oil paint or musical sounds. It is meaning. In the same way, over a lifetime, human beings become something greater than the sum of their parts. When people die, we mourn them not because they were good bodies, but because they represented a certain meaning. This is what Sachs writes about: the undefined, meaningful, precious self. Oliver Sacks. Born in London in 1933 to physician parents, Sachs gained his medical degree at Oxford University. Moving to the United States in the 1960s, he did an internship in San Francisco and a residency at the University of California, Los Angeles. He settled in New York in 1965, and his work in the 1960s dealing with the victims of sleepy sickness at the Beth Abraham Hospital in the Bronx is well known. He treated them with a then experimental drug, L-Dopa, which enabled many to come back to normal life. The experiments became the subject of his book Awakenings, 1973, which inspired the Harold Pinter play A Kind of Alaska and the Hollywood movie Awakenings, starring Robert De Niro and Robin Williams. In addition to having a private practice, Sachs is a clinical professor of neurology at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine and an adjunct professor of neurology at the New York University School of Medicine. He is also a consulting neurologist to the Little Sisters of the Poor religious order. He has received many honorary doctorates. Other books include Seeing Voices, A Journey into the World of the Deaf, 1990, An Anthropologist on Mars, 1995, The Island of the Colorblind, 1996, and Uncle Tungsten, Memories of a Chemical Boyhood, 2001. Chapter 44. Barry Schwartz. The following are quotes from his 2004 book, The Paradox of Choice. Unlike other negative emotions, anger, sadness, disappointment, even grief, what is so difficult about regret is the feeling that the regrettable state of affairs could have been avoided, and that it could have been avoided by you if only you had chosen differently. After millions of years of survival based on simple distinctions, it may simply be that we are biologically unprepared for the number of choices we face in the modern world. In a nutshell, paradoxically, happiness may lie in limiting our choices rather than increasing them. Books in a similar vein: Daniel Gilbert's Stumbling on Happiness and Martin Seligman's Authentic Happiness. Is it good or bad to have choice? Based on the findings of psychologists, economists, market researchers, and experts working in the field of decision-making, the paradox of choice, why more is less, begins with psychologist Barry Schwartz reeling off facts and figures on how many brands of cereal he can buy in his local supermarket, how many types of television set there are to choose from, and how the sales assistant doesn't know what he means when he asks for regular jeans in a clothing store, because with today's infinite variety, there is no such thing as regular. Schwartz cites a study in which two groups of college students were asked to rate boxes of chocolates. The first group was given only a small box of 6 chocolates to taste and rate, The second was given a box of 30. The result? Those offered the smaller array were more satisfied with the chocolates they were given. They literally tasted better than those given the greater choice. They even opted to be paid for their time in the form of chocolates rather than cash. This is a surprising result, since we would assume that greater choice makes us feel better about the choices available. It is a form of power. In fact, when offered less choice, we seem to be more satisfied with what we are given. Schwartz says that this indicates a particular type of anxiety found in rich, developed nations. That is, too much choice can adversely affect our happiness, since it does not necessarily mean greater quality of life or more freedom. The rising cost of decisions. Schwartz skillfully points out the rising costs of having to make more and more decisions. Technology was meant to save us time. Instead, he notes, it has brought us back to foraging behavior, as we now have to sift through thousands of options to find what we really need. Once, for instance, people had little or no choice in who provided their phone or utility services. Now, the options are often so bewildering that we end up sticking with our old provider, just to avoid the hassle of considering all the various deals on offer. In the world of work, while our parents may have spent their whole career with one company, today's generation routinely changes jobs every 2 to 5 years. We are always on the lookout for something better, even if we are relatively happy in our current position. In our romantic lives, again, the choices are legion. Even when we have settled on the one, we have to decide, whose family should we live near? If both of us are working, whose job will determine where we live? If we have children, which one will stay at home with the kids? Even with religion, Schwartz observes, we now follow the faith of our choosing, not the one our parents gave us. We can choose our identities, the very stuff of who we are. Although we are all born with a certain ethnicity, family, and class, such things are now seen as nothing more than baggage. They used to tell others a lot about who we are, but now we can assume nothing. With so many factors that were once out of our hands, now choices, something else is brought into play. The human mind's susceptibility to error, which Schwartz goes to some lengths to illustrate. Given this susceptibility, the chances of making a correct decision most of the time are pretty low. The consequences of some mistakes may not be great, but others are. Choosing a marriage partner, for instance, or which college to attend, will shape our lives. The more options we have, the more is at stake if we make the wrong decision. Our reasoning becomes, if there was so much choice, how did I get it so badly wrong? Schwartz highlights 3 effects of the mushrooming in our choices and options. 1. Each decision requires more effort. 2. Mistakes are more likely. And 3. The psychological consequences of those mistakes are greater. When only the best may not do. Given that we often make wrong decisions, and given the sheer number of decisions we need to make, surely it would make more sense to seek what is good enough, rather than always seeking the best. Schwartz is fascinating in his division of people into maximizers and satisficers. Maximizers are people who are not happy unless they have obtained the best, in whatever circumstance. This requires them to look at every option before coming to a decision, whether they are trying on 15 sweaters or 10 potential partners. Satisficers are those who are willing to settle for what is merely good enough without needing to make sure there is some better option. Satisficers have certain criteria or standards that, if met, will make their decision for them. They don't have an ideological need to obtain the best. The concept of satisficing was introduced by economist Herbert Simon in the 1950s. Simon's fascinating conclusion was that, if you take into account the time required to make decisions, satisficing is actually the best strategy. Schwartz wondered, given the effort they put into choosing, do maximizers actually make better decisions? He found that, objectively, the answer was yes, but subjectively, it was no. By this he means that maximizers may arrive at what they believe is the best available choice, but the choice will not necessarily make them happy. They may get a slightly better job with slightly higher wages, but they are unlikely to be satisfied with their position. Being a maximizer can exact a bitter toll on our life. If everything we do has to be just right, we lay ourselves open for hefty self-criticism. We crucify ourselves for choices we made that didn't turn out right, and wonder why we never explored other options. The phrase shoulda, coulda, woulda sums up the state of many a maximizer in a tangle over their decisions, and Schwartz sums up their lot with a cartoon of a downcast freshman sporting a college sweater emblazoned with "Brown, but my first choice was Yale." In contrast, satisficers are more forgiving of themselves for mistakes, thinking, "I did what I did based on the choices before me." Satisficers don't believe they can create a perfect world for themselves, and so are less bothered when, as is normally the case, the world is imperfect. Studies show that maximizers are generally less happy, less optimistic, and more prone to depression than their satisficing cousins. If you want more peace of mind and life satisfaction, be a satisficer. Happy within limits. In the last 4 decades, Schwartz notes, Americans' per capita income, with inflation taken into account, has doubled. The number of homes with dishwashers has gone from 9 to 50%, and the number of those with air conditioning has increased from 15 to 73%. Yet there has been no measurable increase in happiness in the same period. What does provide happiness is close relationships with family and friends, and there is the paradox. Close social ties actually decrease our choices and autonomy in life. Marriage, for instance, lessens our freedom to have more than one romantic or sexual partner. If this is so, it follows that happiness must be linked to having less, not more, freedom and autonomy. Then can it be, Schwartz asks, that freedom of choice is not all it's cracked up to be? After all, the time we spend having to deal with our thousands of choices is time that we might have invested in our precious relationships. Choices may not only not improve the quality of our life, but may actually lessen it. In this equation, some level of constraint may be liberating. Schwartz notes a study in which 65% of people said if they got cancer, they would want to control what treatment they received. But among people who actually have cancer, a full 88% did not want to choose. We think we want choice, but when we actually have it, it becomes less attractive. Too much choice actually causes us distress. Why everything suffers from comparison. Schwartz points to studies suggesting that the need to consider trade-offs in choices makes people both indecisive and less happy. When confronted with 2 attractive options to buy, for instance, we are in fact not likely to buy either. Perhaps the key to understanding why more choices do not make us more happy is that they increase our level of responsibility. In this context, there is significant research showing that we are happier when we know our decisions are not reversible. This is because when we make a decision that we know can't be changed, we work to justify that decision in our mind and put all our psychological weight behind it. Flexibility in our attitude to marriage, for example, will naturally weaken the marriage. Once, if you lived and worked in a blue-collar neighborhood with all your friends in the same boat, you may have been pretty happy with your lot. But with the advent of television, the internet, and so on, we have an enormous pool of other people to whom we can compare ourselves. Even if we are relatively well off, there are always others who are richer. These are what Schwartz calls upward comparisons, and they tend to make us jealous, hostile, and stressed, and to lower our self-esteem. The downward comparison, in contrast, involves us noting how fortunate we are compared to those who have little. Such comparisons boost mood and self-esteem and lower anxiety. Simply saying to ourselves every morning and evening, "I have a lot of things to be grateful for," and thinking about them brings us closer to reality and increases our happiness. Grateful people are healthier, happier, and more optimistic than people who are not. Because more choices bring more opportunities for comparison, The recipe for happiness is simple and twofold. 1. Make your decisions irreversible. And 2. Constantly appreciate the life you do have. Final comments. An abundance of choice is one of the main sources of psychological pain, since it involves the anxiety of missed opportunities and the regret of paths not taken. Yet this peculiar sort of misery, which was once experienced by a relative few, has been turned into almost an epidemic, with rising wealth and increased choice. In a global village, we cannot help but wonder why we are not as famous as Madonna or as rich as Bill Gates, or how banal or restricted our life seems by comparison. If you are a maximizer, The Paradox of Choice could be a life-changing book. If you have put yourself into agonies over if only, it could make you see that how satisfied you are with life depends not on the actual quality of your experiences, but whether or not you perceive a gap between how things are and how they might be. Schwartz includes a couple of 7-question surveys so you can determine whether you are a maximizer or a satisficer. He admits that he is a satisficer, and it shows in his writing. The Paradox of Choice is clearly not the result of years of toil to get every line and phrase just right, so that it would be the best possible book about choice and decision-making. Yet it succeeds because Schwartz has spent decades thinking about these issues and the impact they can have on our happiness. Barry Schwartz. Schwartz received a BA from New York University in 1968 and a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania in 1971. In line with his own theory about limiting the number of choices in life, Schwartz has taught and researched at the one university for the last 35 years. In 1971, he became an assistant professor at Swarthmore College, Pennsylvania, and is currently at Psychology Department's Dorwin Cartwright Professor of Social Theory and Social Action. He also married Jung and has stayed married. Schwartz has published many journal articles in the fields of learning, motivation, values, and decision-making. Other books include The Battle for Human Nature, Science, Morality, and Modern Life, 1986. The Cost of Living, How Market Freedom Erodes the Best Things in Life, 2001. And Psychology of Learning and Memory, 5th edition, 2001, with E. Wasserman and S. Robbins. Chapter 45. Martin Seligman. The following are quotes from his 2002 book, Authentic Happiness. This was an epiphany for me. In terms of my own life, Nikki hit the nail right on the head. I was a grouch. I had spent 50 years enduring mostly wet weather in my soul, and the last 10 years as a walking nimbus cloud in a household radiant with sunshine. Any good fortune I had was probably not due to being grumpy, but in spite of it. In that moment, I resolved to change. Very happy people differ markedly from both average and unhappy people, in that they all lead a rich and fulfilling social life. The very happy people spend the least time alone and the most time socializing, and they are rated highest on good relationships by themselves and also by their friends. In a nutshell, happiness has little to do with pleasure, and much to do with developing personal strengths and character. Books in a similar vein. David D. Burns' Feeling Good. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi's Creativity. Daniel Gilbert's Stumbling on Happiness. Daniel Goleman's Working with Emotional Intelligence. And Barry Schwartz's The Paradox of Choice. For every 100 scientific journal articles on sadness, there is only one for happiness. The science of psychology has always been about what is wrong with people, Martin Seligman notes, and in the last 50 years it has become pretty successful at diagnosing and treating mental illness. But this focus has meant that much less attention has been given to finding out what makes people happy or fulfilled. For the first 30 years of his working life, Seligman himself worked in the field of abnormal psychology, but his work on feelings of helplessness and pessimism led him to research optimism and positive emotion, and how their presence could be increased in our life. This work caused him to rethink the larger purpose of psychology, and he is now known as the founder of the positive psychology movement. While his 1991 book, Learning Optimism, is an acknowledged classic, Authentic Happiness, Using the New Positive Psychology to Realize Your Potential for Lasting Fulfillment, has also had a significant impact as a sort of manifesto for positive psychology, and has much to teach us about leading a good and meaningful life. What causes happiness? Collating hundreds of research findings, Seligman makes the following points about some of the factors conventionally thought to bring happiness. Money. Purchasing power in the last 50 years has more than doubled in rich nations like the United States, Japan, and France, but overall life satisfaction has not changed at all. Very poor people have a lower level of happiness, but once a certain basic income and purchasing power has been reached, barely comfortable, beyond this point, there are no increases in happiness on a par with extra wealth. Seligman notes, how important money is to you, more than money itself, influences your happiness. Materialistic people are not happy. Marriage. In a huge survey looking at 35,000 Americans over the last 30 years, the National Opinion Research Center found that 40% of married people said that they were very happy. Only 24% of divorced, separated, and widowed people were very happy. This statistic has been borne out in other surveys. Marriage seems to increase happiness levels independent of income or age, and that is true for both men and women. In one of Seligman's own studies, he found that nearly all very happy people are in a romantic relationship. Sociability. Nearly all those who consider themselves very happy lead a rich and fulfilling social life. They spend the least time alone among their peers. People who spend a lot of time alone generally report a much lower level of happiness. Gender. Women experience twice as much depression as men and tend to have more negative emotions. However, they also experience many more positive emotions than men. That is, women are both sadder and happier than men. Religion. Religious people are consistently shown to be happier and more satisfied with life than the non-religious, have lower rates of depression, and are more resilient to setbacks and tragedy. One study found that the more fundamentalist the adherents of a religion are, the more optimistic they are. Orthodox Jews are more hopeful for the future, for instance, than Reform Jews. The sermons in evangelical Christian churches are rosier than those heard in regular Protestant congregations. This strong hope for the future, as Seligman terms it, makes people feel really good about themselves and the world. Illness. Illness does not affect life satisfaction or happiness nearly as much as we would think. Good health on its own is taken for granted, and only severe or multiple illnesses actually lower people's normal level of positive feeling. Climate. Climate has no effect on happiness levels. Seligman remarks, people suffering through a Nebraska winter believe people in California are happier, but they are wrong. We adapt to good weather completely and very quickly. Finally, intelligence and a high education level have no appreciable effect on happiness. Neither does race, although some groups, such as Black Americans and Hispanics, record lower levels of depression. Character and happiness. All the above factors have traditionally been seen as the chief factors causing happiness, but the research indicates that together they account for only 8 to 15% of your happiness. Considering that the factors relate to very basic things about who you are and your circumstances in life, this is not a high figure. As Seligman suggests, it is great news for people who believe that their circumstances preclude them from being happy. Instead of the just mentioned factors, Seligman's view is that genuine happiness and life satisfaction arise through the slow development of something you may last have heard your grandparents speak of character. Character is made up of universal virtues that are found across every culture and in the literature of every age. It includes wisdom and knowledge, courage, love and humanity, justice, temperance, and spirituality, among other things. We achieve these virtues by cultivating and nurturing personal strengths, such as originality, valor, integrity, loyalty, kindness, and fairness. The idea of character has long fallen out of favor because it is thought to be old-fashioned and unscientific. But Seligman says that character traits or personal strengths are both measurable and acquirable, which makes them suitable for psychological study. Strengths and happiness. There is a difference between talents, which we are born with and which we are therefore automatically good at, and strengths, which we choose to develop. We are more inspired, Seligman notes, by someone who overcomes a great obstacle to achieve something than by someone who does so because of simple natural ability. If will and determination are applied to our talent, we have pride in our accomplishments in the same way that we feel proud if we are complimented on our honesty. Talents alone say something about our genes, but virtues and developed talents, making the most of personal strengths, say something about us. Through the refinement of our signature strengths, Seligman provides a questionnaire to identify them. We gain satisfaction in life and happiness that is genuine. It is a mistake to spend our life trying to correct our weaknesses, Seligman says. Rather, the most success in life and real gratification, authentic happiness, come from developing your strengths. Does your past determine your future happiness? For most of the history of psychology, the answer to the above question has been a resounding yes, from Freud to the inner child self-help movement. But the actual research findings point another way. For example, someone under the age of 11, whose mother dies, has a slightly higher risk of depression later in life, but the risk is only slight. Only if they are female, and even then, it shows up in only about half the studies. A parental divorce has only a marginally disruptive effect on late childhood and adolescence, and this wanes in later life. Adult depression, anxiety, addictions, bad marriage, anger. None of these can be blamed on what happened to us as a child. Seligman's message is a strong one. We are wasting our life if we think our childhood has delivered present misery, or if it has made us passive about the future. What matters is the development of personal strengths that do not depend on the quality of our childhood or current circumstances. Can happiness really be increased? To some extent, the answer is no. A lot of research suggests that people have set ranges of happiness or unhappiness that are genetically inherited, just like people tend to revert, despite dieting, to a certain body weight. It has been shown that even after a big lottery win, a year later the winner will return to the same level of sadness or happiness that was their natural lot before the windfall. Seligman is blunt in his assertion that our level of happiness cannot be lastingly increased. However, what is possible is to live in the upper reaches of our natural range. Expression of emotion. The idea of emotional hydraulics says we need to ventilate negative emotions. Otherwise, their repression will cause mental problems. In the West, people think it is healthy to express anger and unhealthy to bottle it up. But Seligman writes that the reverse is correct. When we dwell on something that has been done to us and how we are going to express it, the feeling gets even worse. Studies of type A, intense, driven people, have shown that it is expressing hostility rather than feeling it that is the link to having a heart attack. Blood pressure actually goes down when people decide to bottle up their anger or express friendliness. The Eastern way of feel the anger but don't express it is a key to happiness. In contrast, the more gratitude you experience for people or things in your life, the better you feel. Seligman's students had a Gratitude Night, in which they invited someone along they wanted to thank for what they'd done for them, in front of everyone. The people involved were generally on a high for days or weeks afterward. Our brain is built so that we can't make ourselves forget things just because we want to. But what we can do is forgive, which removes and even transforms the sting. Not forgiving doesn't really punish the perpetrator, whereas forgiving can transform ourselves and bring back our life satisfaction. Final comments. We now live in a world offering endless shortcuts to happiness. We don't have to make much effort to get a positive feeling. But strangely, the easy availability of pleasures tends to leave a yawning hole in many people's lives because it demands zero growth of them as people. A life of pleasures makes us a spectator, not an engager with life. We master nothing and do not use our creativity. A real life is one where we seek out and respond to constant challenges. Seligman believes that we need a psychology of rising to the occasion, or what he calls the Harry Truman effect. When Truman took over from Franklin Delano Roosevelt after FDR died in office, against everyone's expectations, he turned out to be one of the great American presidents. The position revealed his character and allowed his long-honed personal strengths to be utilized. Whether or not we are happy every moment is largely irrelevant. Like Truman, what matters is whether or not we choose to develop what is within us. Happiness does not come along, but involves choices. One of the best features of authentic happiness are the tests you can take to determine your levels of optimism, your signature strengths, and so on. Some readers won't like the vignettes of Seligman's personal life that are dropped in throughout the book, such as how he won the presidency of the American Psychological Association. But these do spice the book up, and are often amusing. Amazingly, Seligman admits to having spent the first 50 years of his life as a grumpy person. But the mountain of evidence about happiness pushed him into thinking that he should apply it to himself. We can no longer allow ourselves to believe that happiness is some mystical thing enjoyed only by other people. The paths to it are clearer than ever, and it is up to us to take responsibility for our state of mind. Martin Seligman. Born in Albany, New York in 1942, to parents who were both public servants, Seligman attended the Albany Academy for Boys in New York. He graduated summa cum laude in his B.A. from Princeton University in 1964, and received his Ph.D. in psychology from the University of Pennsylvania in 1967. He has been a professor of psychology at UPenn since 1976. In 1998, he was elected president of the American Psychological Association, from which he has also received 2 distinguished scientific contribution awards. Past presidents of the association include William James, John Dewey, Abraham Maslow, and Harry Harlow. Seligman has authored 200 academic articles and 20 books, including Helplessness, 1975 and 1993, Abnormal Psychology, 1982 and 1995 with David Rosenhan, Learned Optimism, 1991, What You Can Change and What You Can't, 1993, and The Optimistic Child, 1995. He is married and has 7 children.